Okay, so I also want, just like Citlali, thank everybody for being here in this very last session of a Sunday. Such a beautiful day outside, and you're all here listening to us. So thank you very much. I also want to thank my colleagues from the other countries for being here, for providing support. To Anna for sharing. Anna is our expert researcher in Spain, and she has kindly shared her interviews with us so we can do this analysis. And I want to especially thank INVALSI for providing me the opportunity to work in this project. I am an external collaborator for INVALSI. I work in this project in Learning to Learn, but also on dell'infanzia, which is a tool that we're developing for self-assessment of preschool teachers and their schools. So I'm working in these two projects, and this is the reason why I decided to look into the interviews with the perspective of early childhood education, because this is the area where I work. I also want to say that I am a quantitative researcher. So this opportunity to look into the data with a different lens was something very rich for me. I can see it as the best example throughout my career on learning to learn, because I have had to activate lots of competencies inside of me. Like to learn how to, a new tool. I tend to look at frequencies and statistics. So this was very rich, and I have learned lots from my colleagues, which is something I really appreciate. And I also had to learn to say stop, because I wanted to continue reading the interviews to try to understand better what I was doing. I was reading in Spanish and in Italian, and then translating into English to bring this presentation. So it was a challenge, and also telling myself, you can, so continue working on this. So this is where I come from, and also I have to say that throughout these 2 days I have been listening. Why are we looking into this topic with a qualitative approach? And I think it's very important to look into this topic first with a qualitative approach, because the large-scale surveys have an important function, but sometimes we cannot get the detail that we want and that we can obtain from qualitative studies. So I think it's the best place to start, and we're doing this. This is the first phase of the project. We hope that it will continue and convert into something bigger, but at the moment we have lots of information. Here today I'm just going to share with you the results from Italy and Spain and on early childhood education, but we have plenty of information that we are planning to analyze in the coming months. Now I need to know how to, yeah, there. I have skipped one, so I have to go back. Sorry. And here it's better. Yeah, perfect. Okay, so why early years and why learning to learn? Well, research in neurobiology, neurosciences, developmental psychology, and economics, they all coincide that rich learning opportunities for young children bring a strong foundation, not only for subsequent school performance, but also for other outcomes in life. So it is during the early years where we can really build this strong foundation for children to continue learning. We know there is a metaphor from the University of Harvard, the Child Development Center, that they use a serve and return metaphor, like tennis or ping pong, where caregivers and teachers can if they react in an adequate way to the needs of the children, they can build these neurological connections that can then strengthen, and then the more it's like gymnastics. The more you do it, the better the brain gets. And if we do it in the very first years, then we have more opportunities for children to develop more complex skills. And learning to learn also has to be done gradually, whereas at the beginning we can teach children some very basic things. Then as children age, this can become a more complex system. But if they don't have the foundations very strong from the beginning, then what we can do can be very limited. There is this quote from one of the teachers in Italy saying that the children were like a well, that it was empty, but it is through the stimulus that we can really build up and provide them more opportunities for growing and learning. Then learning to learn, it has been recognized of utmost importance in the 21st century, and I don't need to tell you why it's of utmost importance. Yesterday we had a keynote speech on how the world is changing and how we need other and different skills. So this is one of these competencies that we claim that is needed in the 21st century. Many European countries and Latin American countries have implemented them in their curriculum. This is more recent, and I think it is important to say that psychologists and pedagogues have been recognizing the importance of these skills from a long, long time ago. But it's only until economists, like Professor James Heckman, that started looking at competencies, then the attention of all the international organization was caught. And then they start to say, oh, but we also need to look into these things. And we can have a big debate on whether this is good or bad, whether the international organizations like the OECD should be saying what to do. But I think it's important that they raise this radar, because then we're all talking about this. We're trying to see how these things work, why they are important, and we can also give it another focus. So here in this project, we want to study learning to learn, to try to understand it from the perspective of the teachers. It's like a bottom-down approach and not the other way around, which is what usually takes place. This research, as I was saying a while ago, I don't need to repeat it, is part of this project coordinated by INVALSI, where there are 6 countries participating. The objective is to look at the cultural connotation, because there are many cultural aspects in learning to learn that we really need to disentangle and understand, and it's only through a qualitative study that we can really do this. And we want to see what are the possible similarities between countries and differences, and what culture also might be explaining behind this big construct. Right now we're in the qualitative phase, and we have conducted semi-structured interviews for teachers of children that are 5, 10, 13, or 15 years old. So it's like early childhood education, primary school, and low secondary school. It is INVALSI who developed this instrument, a guide for the interview. It was based on constructs from the literature, and it was translated and adapted to Spanish and Portuguese. And we worked closely with our partner countries to do this adaptation. And then it was also tested. We also conducted pilot surveys in each of the pilot interviews in each of the countries to see whether the instrument was working or not, and how to have a final version. So there has been all this work behind what we are presenting here in these 2 days. And the objective of my presentation of the work that I have been doing is to analyze what preschool teachers in Italy and Spain are doing to foster learning to learn. What exactly are the activities that they're doing to promote this competence? And if possible, I wanted to identify possible similarities and differences by country, by type of school, and characteristics of teachers, which is what you were saying. Unfortunately, this second point has many limitations, and well, I'll explain about them later on. But we hope that once we have all the interviews, we have more than 100 interviews from the 6 participating countries, we can do something more rigorous on this second aspect. The methodology where we used the interview had 20 questions. Here, of course, I'm not using the 20 questions. I'm just using a few of them to try to understand what the teachers were saying. The participants are only the teachers of 5-year-old children, and the data is we have a total of 15 interviews between Italy and Spain, 10 interviews from Spain, and 5 interviews in Italy. Also, I have to clarify that Spain is only Cantabria, the autonomous region of Cantabria, and not the whole country. we INVALSI define criteria for countries to follow in order to select the sample of schools that were participating. So we gave them some suggestions, like schools needed to be willing to participate, we needed to have access to those schools, they needed to also sign some privacy and ethical issues that we were concerned of. So this also took place. We suggested having some geographical distribution if this was possible, and what other things and the teachers have to have an experience of at least 5 years of experience, and this was important because of the kind of questions that we make. Well, so here what you have on the slide is kind of the characteristics of the sampling in Italy and Spain. So in Italy, we had 5 interviews, kind of scattered north, center, south. All of them were public schools. Most of them were all of them were medium socioeconomic level. And then there were mostly urban, and one was in a rural setting. In Spain, however, it's in Cantabria. And just to give you an idea of what Cantabria is, because many of you might not know, it's there in the map. The capital of Cantabria is Santander. And I was thinking that for Italians, it is kind of like the Costa Amalfitana in Liguria, let's say so, because it's in the north of Spain, so it's kind of the richer part of the country. It has sea and mountains, and it's supposed to be a beautiful place, but the socioeconomic conditions of Cantabria are not the same as those of Andalusia. So we need to take that into account, that what we're observing here in Spain is of a more privileged context than the one that we might be in Italy. We have a scatter, and we only have 5 interviews. So here's my quantitative mind saying, oh, this is very small. Yes, it's very small. We cannot conclude anything. So we want to join all the other interviews to see what's happening and see what we can say. But we're getting some results that are interesting to analyze and to learn for this first step of the project. So the analysis that I conducted, what it's kind of called interpretive approach, that is all the interviews, once interviewers finished doing them, they were transcribed. And these transcriptions is the ones that I have analyzed, following a coding criterion of representative categories. So I had to see what Daniela was explaining on the definition of learning to learn, and trying to see within all the interviews what is it that was coming up that was related with these activities to learning to learn. And then they were classified. So first I started reading all of the interviews, then identifying the answers to the questions that I was interested in, which are the activities that you are doing in the classroom to foster learning to learn. So I was concentrating on this too, but then I also realized that to understand the responses, I had to read also other questions and focus on other questions that were talking about what are the characteristics of today's students, and what are the activities that really engage them into learning. So I also had to complement this analysis with other questions within the interview. I had to learn this new software, which is MaxQDA, that has a great way of coding all the wordings that the teachers have, and then you can kind of more easily try to organize and see how some categories are being said more frequently. So this is when I looked at the frequencies and responses, and then at the end, well, I tried to see if I could have identify some difference by some of the characteristics of school and by country. So this is a word cloud of one of the first questions of the 2 first questions of the questionnaire, and I thought it was important to show you this slide because this is what teachers are saying on an answer that we have in the interviews, saying whether they believe there are any differences between the children of today and the children of a few years ago. And this is important because this is how teachers perceive the children they have in their classroom. What are their needs and what I can do to engage them into learning. And a colleague of mine, who's not here today, Toto Patera, has looked into these two questions into more depth, and he has found some very, very interesting findings. Here I just want to highlight two things that emerge in both countries, but that they're repetitive, and they were coming from all the teachers. The first thing is that children of today know much more, have much more information than what they used to have. They call them digital children, and they're just 5-year-olds. They were saying that before, part of the curriculum of preschool is to teaching them the colors. What are the primary colors? And they arrive knowing a range of colors that their teaching, they have more challenges on how to make their teaching interesting, because these children know lots of things. On the other hand, they are more fragile emotionally speaking. They're not autonomous. They have no self-regulation of their emotions. They do lots of capricci, in Italiano, caprichos in Spanish. And this is also a big challenge for the teachers, because they say that they cannot even play by themselves because they do not know how to do so. They have to take them by the hand to do many of the activities that before children tended to do it more easily. And some of them would attribute this to changes in the family. And I won't go into this, but this was more expressed in Italy, saying that there has been a change in families and that relationship between families and schools, with families perceiving in a less respectful way the work of the teachers. Okay, so one of the questions that I'm looking at is to see what did the teachers say that works best to engage children in their learning, which activities in the classroom involve the most children. And this is more like general, it's not related with learning to learn, but more general. And both in Italy and in Spain, there were these typical activities of kindergarten, like manual, creative activities, because for them, developing curiosity is very important. It is through arts and crafts that they can do so, and that children enjoy the most, because they can construct, they can touch, they can learn by doing. And this is something that came up in both countries, and play. And this is something very good to know, that it is through play that children are learning. And in Spain there were lots of mentionings of corners. So they have a corner that children can choose which activity they engage in, and then this was also linked to learning to learn, which I'll explain in a while. But this is like the kind of activities. In Italy also, physical and motor activities. Children need to move, to do physical things, to release all the energy they have. So this also came up very frequently. And the others were all the typical activities that we know in kindergarten, like story fables, teamwork, and some mentions already about problem solving, etc., which are part of learning to learn. And then this is the same question, but I wanted to see in each school how many different activities each school had said, because the more variety of activities, you think that, well, maybe they might be more stimulated than in those that might only name one or two. So here, it's a first picture, and that there's some schools that do plenty of things, many different activities, with 4, 6 mentions of different activities, and then there are others that could only name 1 or 2. Here, I also want to read it with caution, because I think it needs a further reading to really ensure that I am extracting everything, and I need to also consult my colleagues on this point. But I think the picture is that there are some schools that do a lot, others that don't do that many. This is the question specifically on what are the practices that you are doing to foster learning to learn. And here we observe in the case of Italy that the teamwork, collaboration comes a lot, critical sense, questioning what are you doing, whether not only doing what the teacher tells you, but they try. 2 teachers were mentioning they try to motivate the children to ask themselves why they're doing what they're doing. The other one on reflection of tasks done, the path taken to arrive to the goal, to analyze, to think, and then some problem solving, but not very frequent. And thank you. And then in Spain, again, place-based activities, be it organized or free. The corner, the activities by corner, it's kind of related with these play-based activities. And the teacher was explaining that she believes that the corners, the activities by corners, it is a learning to learn activity because the child has to choose the activity that he has to do. So that he's already deciding on what he needs to do. He's autonomous to work on it, so he's developing his autonomy. And then in many cases in the corners they have to work with other children. So there he's also developing his teamwork or collaboration spirit. So here we can also see that, well, maybe in Spain there were more activities that were mentioned than in Italy, but well, it's difficult still to say. We still need to consider whether this coding and classification that I have been doing is we validated between in our team. And then this is the same, but sorry, no, this shouldn't be here. It's this one. This is by school, the same, just presenting activities by school to see whether there were more schools mentioning the kind of activities that we're looking after in learning to learn. And here we see that there are some schools that mention several activities, and then there are others that cannot mention much. They talk about teamwork, collaboration, and communication in school 4 and 2 in Italy, and then in Spain we also have others that have plenty of activities and others that have very little, just one activity. So there's a divide. In Italy, for example, there was a school that the ones that were not mentioning much, were just sticking to the manual activities, kind of the same answer that they had given in question 3. But there was another school, and we're talking about a bee-bot, that they asked children to program a little bee that has to follow a different path for it to reach a certain point. So the children have to get together to do this coding for the bee to get to its final point, and then they discuss the results and see what would you have done differently for this bee to arrive to this final point. So there you can see that this is a teacher who's really aware of what's going on, is using technology, etc. And another school that's more in the traditional way of teaching, and that learning to learn is still not embedded into their practices. So we see a big divide, and in Spain there will be similar cases. So this is a comparison of the two questions. So on the right here I have the case of, sorry, the title is not there. This is Italy on the left hand side and Spain on the right hand side, and it was just trying to see whether there were some schools that have how many, the frequency of responses of each of the activities, general activities, learning to learn activities, and by geographical location to see whether there were any differences by geographical location, and socioeconomic status. In Italy, they were all medium social class, so there's no difference. But then in terms of geographical, the schools that we could say that were the ones that were implementing more practices were based in Lazio and in Tuscany, and the ones that were doing less was in a rural location in Lombardia and in Reggio Calabria. But these are 5 interviews, so please don't read more than that, but this is what the results show. And on the other hand, we have Spain, and here by socioeconomic status, it's just medium and medium low, the ones that were the best, that have more mentions of learning to learn activities. It's not the best. They were just mentioning more. But there in the middle was those of low socioeconomic classes, so not really. In terms of type of school, because in Spain they had public and private, it was the private schools, the ones that had less mention instead of the public ones. So this is something interesting that I need to pursue also with my colleague in Spain to see what's going on there. But at the moment, we want to do this kind of analysis, see if we can say a little bit more, but at the moment it seems also like a mixed portrait. So, the limitations, notes of caution with these results. First of all, they're preliminary. I need to validate and discuss with the interviewers and researchers in both countries. I didn't perform the interviews, and this is a big drawback, because I think only when you do an interview you can really understand what the interviewee, in this case the teacher, is telling you. I have just read the transcripts, and I have learned lots, but whatever I'm interpreting has its limitations in that sense. And so that's why I need to discuss with the interviewers. Second limitation is that, what we need to do is also discuss the results with the international team. We want to do a coding that we can kind of agree upon among us that it's a correct coding with, of course, its local adaptations, because there might be things that do not work out in all of the 6 countries, so we need to do this. Another big limitation is that this is the reading and interpretation of a quantitative researcher. I have been lucky to work with qualitative colleagues throughout my career, but it's not the same to be reading the interviews. I have less of an experience of interpreting whatever the teacher said, but I have to confess that I really enjoyed doing it. And the sample size, they're very small. We just have 5 interviews in Italy and 10 interviews in Spain. So that's why we want to put together the interviews of preschool of the 6 countries. That would give us more than 30 interviews, and maybe we can have something better to say, more solid. The conclusions at the moment are that the results suggest a mixed portrait. Some teachers have very good knowledge of what learning to do is, how to promote it. They provide very concrete examples of practices, but on the other hand, there are teachers that speak of it very broadly, or they even don't know what it is, or they say, but for young children, why are you asking me about learning to learn? This is more for older children. Like, they really don't understand what the concept is, and they were not able to provide examples. This mixed pattern was observed in both countries. It's not that in one country we have teachers more knowledgeable. It was in both. And there were no clear signs of differences on the number and type of activities by the characteristics of schools, as I was telling you. We need to further look into it. Finally, I want to say that I do believe that the early years is a key stage to engage children's curiosity and promote their desire to continue learning. And that what the teachers are telling us is that they need further support to perform such activities in the classroom, because even if in the curriculum or in the laws they say that they need to do learning to learn, they still don't know what this concept is, many of them, and they don't have the tools to do so. And also we need to convey better the message, why is this important? And it's not only for economic purposes. It is for other purposes, and to deal with many of the challenges that our young generations are doing today, and to create a less unequal world that we have in all our countries, and try to foster these activities in public schools where they are much in need, and not in private. If they are fostered, it's very good, but this is also creating huge inequalities that later on carry other problems that we are observing in all of our countries. So thank you very much for your attention, and sorry for taking a little bit more of time.